The last couple weeks, we had started a series on going deeper. And the concept is that we as Christians are not meant to be stationary and certainly not stagnant. We're to be growing. And I believe firmly, there's a lot in Scripture to indicate this, that we as people were created to be growing, to be improving, to be expanding in almost every way possible. But there's a problem with that, and that is that growth is not comfortable. Growth is not easy, and growth does not happen by default. I think sometimes we're deceived into that because we see these little fellas, and they just seem to grow all by themselves. But that's not really what's happening. There's a lot of things going on with little kids to cause that growth, both physically, intellectually, and socially, every way possible. It takes effort. They have to put dedication to it. And so, as Christians, let us not become satisfied with stagnation. Let's make sure we as individuals are growing and we as congregation are growing. But there's going to be challenges to that. And the challenge that we're going to talk about today is one of darkness, overcoming darkness. And how do we cope with it? And how do we overcome it and get to the backside of it? And so with that, we think about this idea that a ship in the harbor is safe. But that's not where it was designed and meant to be. Very few ships. I know some of you are old enough to remember Pearl Harbor, right? This is a general statement, not an absolute. But ships are safe in harbor. They don't sink. They don't face all the challenges of navigation, of dangerous seas, and all the other problems of being out at sea. And for that reason, we as people oftentimes want to stay in the harbor. Our churches are like that, right? Our individuals are like that. Well, this is what we've always done. This is what I know. This is what I'm comfortable with. We took Christian Friday night, didn't we, Pam? And Amanda, we went for Amanda's birthday, and we asked him ahead of time, said, Christian, would you like to come with us? We're going out to a nice restaurant. He says, well, Dad, if you take me, it'll be a waste of money. I said, they have chicken and they have macaroni and cheese on the menu. It'll be all right. And so he came along and he expanded his horizons a little bit. He tried things he'd never tried before. He grew. Now, Pam grew her horizons a little bit. And she was prepared on the very brink, Tessa, of going even further. And Amanda, what was that appetizer? I know it's hard to choose which one, but the one Pam was going to eat. Ceviche? Did I say that right? And so Amanda hands the dish over, and Pam's got a spoon. She's getting ready to put it on, and she's excited about trying this new dish. And Ernie cracked me up very nonchalantly, without any alarm in his voice, turns, he says, that's fish eggs. and Pam immediately shoved everything out back. Now, she didn't quite go any further than that. Now, here's the thing about us as people, and this is really going to get into our first point. We overemphasize negatives. You see, sometimes we won't try a new food because we're afraid of a negative. And when we allow fear and negative mindsets to overcome us, we never get to the positives. Now, I tried, what was it called again? Ceviche? Ceviche? I tried it. It was not for me, Marcia. Those things explode in your mouth. Not in a positive way. It wasn't for me, but I experienced a lot of other good things I really did like. See, that negative didn't hold me up. And Pam, I realize now the implications why I said Pam had a great time, right? We can't overemphasize the negatives in our lives if we're going to grow, if we're going to become greater. And we've got to be aware of our mindset. This is the reality of life. It's not all going to be good. Now, here's a reality we as Christians don't always talk about. Life is hard. You don't have to be a Christian to have difficulties in your life. In fact, we are blessed to live in a time where very few of the difficulties we have in our lives are caused because we are Christians. Some of them are. If we're living right, some of them are going to be because that we are Christians. But the fact is, life is difficult. God has not said, I'm going to wave my magic wand and keep Christians from having difficulties. That was not the concept. That was not the gospel, the good news that was preached to early Christians. You know, today, the prosperity gospel, some people call it, is very popular, where if you have the right beliefs, if you say things the right way, everything will go good. You'll have what you want and what you need, and you'll get whatever you ask for. You know, that was completely different than what the first century Christians experienced. They experienced the opposite. They lost everything they had physically because they were Christians. But they gained something that was of immense more value. So how do we address our difficulties in our lives? Here's how Paul suggested in Romans 8 and verse 37. He didn't say they weren't going to happen. He didn't say they weren't going to weigh heavy on us. He didn't say they weren't going to be difficult. He didn't say we weren't going to have loss. No, he addressed some of those things. But right before him, he says, here's the God we serve. We serve a God that loved us so much, they didn't even spare his own son. And so will he not give us everything that we need? So in conclusion, in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. You know what's wonderful about that? I don't have to conquer my problem. I don't have to overcome and defeat all my enemies. I am a conqueror through him who loved me. That's our perspective as Christian. That I don't shy away from darkness. I don't shy away from difficulty. I don't shy away from hardship. But rather I face it with my Lord. It's okay to be depleted. It's not okay to be defeated. First century Christians oftentimes were depleted. And here's the point that I want to really draw out before we move on. You know, oftentimes all they had to do to get away from many of the struggles that they faced, sit down, sit back, quit forging ahead, and quit doing the things that God's asked us to do. It can't be enough for us as Christians to come and sit down. It's what some of us are comfortable with. We're going to face difficulty. But we've got to move forward with the gospel at all times. So how do we overcome the darkness that we face in this life? I want to suggest that we can do so by empowering your mind and conquering negative thinking. Now, the passage just before Ernie read for us, I think in verse 19, says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth." Or rather, I made that negative. Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, right? And we so focus on that aspect of what Jesus is saying that sometimes we miss the broader picture. That by the time he gets to verse 22, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. Think about that. If our eye's the window into our souls, our perception is how we bring the world into our hearts. If our eye is dark, or our eye is healthy, the body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Jesus isn't talking about our physical eye, is he? He's using it as an illustration to talk about our mindset. And our mindset affects everything we do. If our mindset is dark, our whole body's going to be dark. So many times people say, "Oh, that can't be done. We can't do that." And you know how often they're right? 100% of the time. Wayne was going to say 0. But I know where you're going, Wayne, and I agree with you. It almost always can be accomplished. But not with that mindset, because our whole body's darkness. We've got to push through. We've got to realize what God has given us. I mentioned the kids growing earlier, and Dad, I know, was traveling yesterday and hasn't made it back with us today. But he struggled a few weeks ago. We were praying for him for his blood pressure, and he became aware of things that he was unaware of his entire life. And broadly speaking, that means that what you eat impacts you, right? And he's been astonished to find out how much sodium is in food. And he's telling us constantly, isn't he, Stephanie? Did you know? Did you know how much sodium's in there? And it's just like blown his whole mind. Right? Now, we're going to address this in a few moments, but giving ourselves open rein in our minds, does it tend to go the negative or positive? It goes negative by default, doesn't it? It will go to a place that is not healthy. And Jesus is kind of alluding to this here, and he addresses it more directly elsewhere. Now, if we just ate whatever was in front of us, and I know I just used the example of sodium, but it gets worse than that, doesn't it? If we just ate whatever was in front of us in a moment, would you expect to be healthy? If we just let our mind run rampant with no checks, with no restraint, with no thought whatsoever to what we're dwelling on, can we expect to be healthy? Not at all. Not at all. This example's all throughout Scripture. Can you imagine in Exodus, we're going to look at Exodus 14, verse 15 in just a moment. You're welcome to open your Bibles there. But what has led up to this situation is God has came to the people in Egypt. He says, I'm going to free you. And you know what they all said, including Moses? This can't be done. This can't be done. Oh, there's no way we could do that. And they were right in the fact there was no way they could have done it. But it wasn't about them, was it? And you know what they did because of that mindset? Every step of the way, they said, I told you this couldn't be done. I should have went back. Let's just go back to Egypt. Here's the first step, I believe, of empowering our mind to overcome negative thinking. God delivers them in all kinds of miraculous ways. He brings them to the Red Sea. And then they turn and they look, and here comes the Egyptians with all their chariots, with all their Apache helicopters, and they are bearing down on these people. And they say, we told you this couldn't be done. Here's what's interesting. In about verse 13 of chapter 14, Moses says to the people, calm down. God is going to take care of this. God is going to fight your battle for you. Sound familiar? I'll bet you verse 15 is not so familiar. How many of you turned to verse 15? Diane, what's verse 15 say? Did you catch that? You've read that probably hundreds of times and we've skipped right over it, haven't we? Moses gives this great speech. God's going to take care of our battles for us. And God responds to Moses. He says, why are you crying to me? Lift your staff and take the people forward. Go. Now, God's not saying I'm not going to take care of this. But to empower our mindset, we've got to first realize that we've got to leave our comfort zone, that we have to act, that we have to do, that we have to go. That we can do that. That we can be successful doing those things. You know, I hear so oftentimes from young, old Christians and not yet Christians. Well, I don't think that I could overcome my problems. I don't think that I could be a Christian with what I have in my life, and so there's really no reason to even start. If that's the message we're sharing, we've got to change that, right? If that's the message you're hearing, please allow God to change that. That is evil thinking that is demonstrating a lack of faith in God to save you. Which, as big of a task as that is, pales in comparison to what He's already done. I can do it through Him who loves me. I've got to get rid of the negative thinking by understanding it's there and saying, no, I'm still going to move forward. Second example is Joshua. In 24 and verse 15, here's at the end of Joshua's life, right? And they've conquered most of this land. And he says to the people, he says, choose you this day whom you are going to serve. Choose who you're going to serve. This is very much what Jesus was saying in Matthew 6 chapter in verses 19 that I mentioned. Choose who you're going to serve. In order to stop the negative thinking, in order to overcome the darkness in my life, I've got to say, I want what God has for me. I'm going to pursue it. You see, sometimes we think as more aged Christians, we get over that, right? And yet I realize that most of my anxiety in my life comes from things that I'm determined I need or I'm going to have or I'm going to do. Rather than saying, God, I'm going to serve you. I am happy to accept what you have for me in my life. Third example is Elijah in 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, in verse 21. Elijah here is facing all the problems of Baal. And prior to this, he's thought he's the last prophet alive. God, I'm the only one, right? And it would have felt that way from Elijah's standpoint. And here, Elijah, this is this iconic test, right? Where Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, you pray to Baal, and I'll pray to my God, and we'll see who consumes the sacrifice, who consumes the altar. And before he prays, and this is interesting to me because it shows the faith of Elijah, before he prays, he says to the people, how long, ESV says it this way, how long will you limp between two fences? I think today we might say it this way, how long will you straddle two fences? And he demonstrates for him there's only one God in this life. Now, what were all the people of that time wrapped up in? You know, sometimes it's easy for us to be judgmental of them. But Ahab was king and Jezebel was queen, and you talk about two names synonymous with evil. Their leaders were evil. In fact, Jezebel would have you put to death for serving God. Elijah says, how long are you going to limp between two fences? You know, sometimes the circumstances of our day, the circumstances of the moment, the politics of the day allow us to get so wrapped up that it creates a negative mindset instead of trusting in God. In order to grow, we must empower our mind and conquer negative thinkings. We must lean fully and wholly on God and trust in His understanding. This is not a political slide, but that's funny. Anyone know what's going on tomorrow? The eclipse. Anyone know what was going on there? Yeah. Did you say President Lincoln? Yeah, that was the picture snapped of President Trump looking at the eclipse in verse 17. So there's a reason I'm going to come back to here. Don't get caught up in all the politics, right? That's not what this slide's about. That's just funny. And it illustrates what we need to do to overcome darkness. We need to look at the sun, not the eclipse. This isn't going to be a problem for us in PA. Because my family, Christian Evie and I were going to go over towards where the path of totality is. And I haven't talked to Christian yet, but have you looked at the weather yet, Christian? I saw a meme on Facebook this morning that had a bright sunny cloud, and it had cloud dark, dark cloud. It said the eclipse in PA, right? It's overcast tomorrow. Maybe not. Maybe we'll get to see it. There's some negative thinking, right? But when we go through our difficult times, here is a spoiler. There are going to be difficult times in our life. And one of the obstacles that we face is I just can't wait until this is over. I can't wait until this is over. Oh, on the backside. Well, you know what happens when we get through that struggle? This just isn't negative thinking. This is the truth. What happens when we get past the struggle we're facing right now? Thank you. We have a new one. This is a part of life. In order to overcome darkness, we don't have to enjoy the negativity. We don't have to enjoy the difficulties in our life, but we have to understand it's a part of life. It's not something to get past so then we can live. It's not something to get through so then we can enjoy ourselves. We are called to be Christians today. We are called to be Christians now. We are called to be Christians in the circumstance that you are currently in. And we need to stare at the sun, not S-O-N, not the eclipse. Matthew 27, verse 45. This is when Jesus was on the cross. Now from the 6th hour, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And there's so much richness here that, you've probably read articles or heard good sermons that I haven't preached, but on the topic of when the sun refused to shine. And here's what I want to draw out of this. Those 3 hours had to happen. They were a part of the process. They were a part of the plan. They were part of the redemption story. And get through the darkness, we have to understand that. There's horrible difficulties in our lives, and I'm still going to remain faithful. I'm still going to keep growing. I'm not going to quit. And I'm not going to quit growing. It's amazing to me in Matthew's 16th chapter, and when you think about those hours of darkness being necessary in the redemption story. In Matthew 16 is in verse 18 is the iconic verse where Peter, prior to that, has confessed that Jesus says, who do men say that I am? And there's all kinds of answers, not all kinds, but at least 3 different answers given. And then Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, man has not revealed this to you. Blessed are you. And upon this rock I will build my church. And if you look at the passage right behind that, Jesus goes on for the first time to tell them what he must suffer and how he will be killed and rise again in 3 days. You ready for that? Jesus just responded to Peter. Upon this rock I will build my church, and what? The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Does anyone know what the word for hell is there? Hades. We miss that because of our translation problems. He's saying the gates of death shall not prevail against it. Amen? Isn't that wonderful news? Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of death shall not prevail against it. I have verse 22 there. It's a little bit after that. Guess what happens? Peter says, I'm not going to let you die. I have my sword in my hand already, but that's the next illustration. No way. And some of the harshest words of rebuke out of our Lord's mouth were reserved for Peter. Because Peter thought we could get to the kingdom without the hours of darkness. Peter just heard Jesus say that the gates of Hades, the gates of hell, the gates of death will not prevail against it, and he thought he could skip over the death part. And Jesus, in short, says, no way, no way. You see, Peter had to go through those hours of darkness in order to receive what he needed on the backside. The next example from John 18th chapter, verse 10, what's amazing to me, amongst other things about this, is each one of the gospel writers tell about this occurrence in the Garden of Gethsemane, where the Judas brings the mob to arrest Jesus, and they're getting ready to take him, and three of the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all tell the disciple drew his sword and cut the ear off one of the high priest's servants. Who was that? Yeah, Malchus was the servant. Who did the cutting? Peter. And you know how we know that? John told on him. The other three disciples said, and a disciple. John says, and Peter. Thanks, John. And Peter draws his sword, and he's going to fight his way out of this. You know what Peter essentially was acting on? I'm going to get to the brightness. I'm going to get to the glory without going through the darkness. In order for us to overcome darkness, we've got to understand that it's going to be part of our lives. It's going to be something we have to deal with, that we have to work through, that we have to grow through. There's going to be difficulties in our lives. There's going to be difficulties in our churches. There's going to be difficulties in our communities. And they are things as Christians that we are called to shine through. And the way we do that is by keeping our eyes on the Son of God and focusing on what we are to accomplish in those times. The road to Emmaus, Luke, the 24th chapter, is this incredible setting. And of course, the resurrection has already occurred, but there's two disciples walking on the way to Emmaus, and they don't know anything about the resurrection. And Jesus walks up to them. He says, hey, what's going on? I love their response in our vernacular today. It's like, ma'am, where have you been? You been hiding under a rock? You see what I did there, Bill? He was under a rock. But where have you been all this time? And so Jesus goes back and tells them throughout the scriptures, the Old Testament passages, about how everything pointed to him and what had taken place. And they're amazed. And they're like, wow, that's great. Wow, I see what you're saying there. Yeah, I see that. And they walk the whole way to where they're going. And then they realize, this is Jesus. Now, Jesus asked them, why are you so upset? They seem to really be struggling with the idea that there had to be darkness. And they're so focused on the darkness. They even mentioned to Jesus, and besides all this, this is the third day, and he said he was going to rise. What if, instead of focusing on the darkness, they were looking for Jesus? You see, sometimes we miss tremendous blessings in our lives because we're so focused on the eclipse that we miss the sun. To overcome darkness, we must fix our eyes on the Son of God. And lastly, I would suggest to you this morning that we need to embrace the new man. I mentioned earlier about the struggles we have as individuals. The challenges that we have in the ways that we fail to be and to do what Jesus has called us to do. In the past, in the present, and unfortunately in the future. And yet, this will come full circle to our negative thinking. I've got to choose how I'm going to identify. Am I defined? Am I described by the failings of my past? Or the failings of my present? or even the failings of my future? Or do I accept my identity in Jesus Christ and in that new man? It's not easy. It's not easy. But if we're going to overcome darkness, if we're going to have the impact that we're called to have in this world, we have to. Come have breakfast. John, the 21st chapter. Jesus is resurrected, right? And it's been some days after the resurrection. And the disciples are on the Sea of Galilee and they're fishing. And they're coming back in the early mornings. And here's this guy on the shore. And they realize it's Jesus. He has breakfast for them. John presented to us, he'd run it by me prior to preaching on it. And I said, no. That's not the way, Peter jumps out of the boat. And I've always pictured him rushing to shore. John did a great job of illustrating it. That's not necessarily what happens there. In fact, there's more evidence suggests that Peter jumps out of the boat to stay behind and do the work. So he didn't have to go face Jesus. But either way that takes place, Jesus is on shore and he singles Peter out. Why? Because Peter has not just simply cut off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. See why I did that? He's also went on to bitterly deny ever knowing Jesus Christ and having anything to do with him. And so Jesus says to him, if I'm going to sum this up, we're going to read this in just a moment, but if I'm going to sum it up, he's saying to Peter, Peter, that's not who you are. That's your old man. That's the worldly man. And I have a completely different identity for you. When they'd finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. What's Jesus say? Feed my lambs. There's the answer to your past failures. There's the answer to your current failures and to your future failures. Feed my lambs. Do my work. Help those who are around you to know Jesus Christ. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me? And he answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He says, take care of my sheep. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time. If we'd stop it right here, you almost get the impression that Jesus is rubbing the failures in, isn't he? That's not at all what he's doing. He's getting to a conclusion. He said, Lord, you know that I love all things, and you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth that when you were younger, you dressed yourself, and when you went where you wanted. But when you were old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God, and he said to him, follow me. And there's this illusion of this span of life here. I want to end very rapidly in this point. Something I think we miss. There's a place in the service of the Lord from birth to death. Jesus saying, Peter, you're going to go a lot of places you don't want to go. Do it following me. Embrace the new man with all your heart. Give your life wholly to him. The invitation this morning is just that simple. If we can help you to do that, to become closer to God, to follow him more fully and wholly, through prayer or anything else in your spiritual life, please make it known. As together we stand and sing.